Okay, wonderful. Over to all of you. Thank you very much for all joining us this morning, this afternoon, or this evening.
Right, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let me just set up the slide share, which takes a couple of seconds because I have to full screen it and update the sharing. So it's a real pleasure to be here, especially as a Ukrainian in this Frontier of Economics for Ukraine series. I really appreciate everybody putting this together. It's a real pleasure. Actually, this paper that I'm presenting today, Artificial Intelligence, Firm Growth and Product Innovation, two of us are Ukrainian co-authors, me and Tanya Babina at Columbia, and our co-author James Hudson at the AI for Good Foundation, and Alex Hay at University of Maryland. So Tanya, James, and I have actually been spending the last 2 months not working on this project, but organizing some of the efforts by the Ukrainian, mostly Ukrainian, but also economists who want to support Ukraine abroad, efforts on things like sanctions, raising awareness about the importance of supporting Ukraine's military at this time, starting to think about kind of how reconstruction is going to ultimately look. So if anybody is interested in joining that, shoot us an email or sign up on the website. So with that said, let's jump into the paper. So in this paper, we study the kind of effect that artificial intelligence has had on the commercial sector in recent years. And it's motivated by the fact that investment in artificial intelligence has really exploded in the past decades. It's around 2010, 2012. And there are several ways in which we think that artificial intelligence might have a benefit for firms that invest in AI. The first is, of course, just straightforward cost reduction, productivity improvements. Maybe firms are investing in AI to automate some of their labor, to streamline some of their processes, and so they're going to be able to produce what they're producing at a lower cost and therefore have higher productivity. The second potential channel is that artificial intelligence itself can potentially be used to improve and speed up the innovation process. So when we search for new products, when we tailor new products to customers, artificial intelligence might help with that. And that will also have benefits on firm growth. Empirically, we know quite little about what artificial intelligence actually does at the firm level. So there's a lot of talk about the potential that AI has to transform production, but so far limited understanding empirically of whether that's happening or not. The reason for that is the difficulty in obtaining comprehensive firm level data on firms' actual investments in artificial intelligence. So this is where our paper comes in. We try to understand AI investments, which firms are actually investing in AI. And then the main question that we ask is whether those investments appear to actually contribute positively to firm growth. And then at the end, we also have some more macroeconomic implications of that. If the benefits of AI investments are unevenly distributed across firms, that can actually affect also industry concentration. We're able to do this for a few reasons. The first is our unique data. So as I mentioned previously, understanding firm level AI investments has been difficult due to difficulty in obtaining firm level data. So that's where we come in. We bring in detailed firm level information on AI talent at the firm. We observe both demand for AI talent, so firms' job postings when they're trying to hire AI workers, as well as actual hiring of AI talent using resumes. So from resumes of employees, we're able to tell who is skilled in AI, who is not, and then aggregating that up to the firm level, we can see which firms are hiring more AI workers. We do this, we kind of assess who's an AI worker, who is not, with a novel data-driven measure of AI relatedness of each job. So we try to avoid, as much as possible, pre-specifying what we mean by AI. We just kind of have very broad AI field in mind, artificial intelligence, machine learning, computer vision, and natural language processing. And then for individual skills in the data, we empirically determine which of these are actually related to the broad notion of AI. And finally, we do want to say something about the effect of AI on firms. And so identification is also quite important to our paper. So we bring in a novel identification strategy where we get at firms ex ante kind of ability to hire AI talent based on firms' pre-existing hiring networks with universities, because universities have been doing AI research for much, much longer than firms have been hiring AI workers. Commercial use of AI only picked up in the last decade after 2010. By contrast, research in AI is, of course, much older. So by leveraging firms' pre-existing pre-2010 networks connections to universities that were historically strong in AI research, those firms will have an easier time actually hiring AI talent when AI does become commercially popular. Preview what we find before I tell you all of these pieces in detail. We see rapid growth in AI across pretty much all industries. Of course, more technical industries have more AI workers, but the relative increase from the beginning of the sample, 2010 to 2018, is there for pretty much all industries. And at the firm level, what we see is that firms that invest more in AI experience increases in sales, increases in employment, and increases in market valuations. Interestingly, when we look at the channels through which this happens, it's coming from innovation. So AI investing firms are able to grow by innovating more. They increase their trademarking activity, their product patenting activity, and their product portfolio changes more. We don't, at least until now, see any gains in terms of reduced costs or increased productivity. So that these firms are producing more, by producing additional new products, more tailored products. They're not necessarily cutting costs. They're definitely not cutting labor, as we actually see that firms investing in AI grow their employment. That's because they're hiring complementary labor like product managers that help them leverage the AI technologies. And I see there is a question by Malesh.
Yeah, I didn't want to cut you off, but it just are you making a statement of correlation or causality here? Like, could it be that just I'm a more creative firm, I do a lot more product innovation, and I also want to invest in this newfangled thing called AI, or is this?
Yeah. So we'll try to convince you that it is AI that is causing growth, and not that firms on kind of pre-existing different trajectories are investing in AI. And we'll do it in different ways. We'll do it by looking kind of more dynamically, right? Looking at pre-trends before AI investments and seeing that it's not much there. And we'll do it using this instrument with kind of firms' ability to hire AI workers due to their pre-existing university connections. So we think that the body of evidence that we bring together is more consistent with the story that it's AI that drives this expansion and not the other way around. Yeah, Cullen?
Sorry, so I think participants who aren't panelists will realize that the reason we're running this series is so we can ask questions too. There's obviously this big debate about how artificial intelligence risks leaving all of us unemployed. You're finding, though, at least very locally, this complementarity between the AI investment and the labor. Mm-hmm. Do you have any reason to believe that that extends beyond the local?
So we look at the industry level as well.
Yes.
So when we aggregate up to the industry level, industries that invest more in AI also grow more and grow more in employment. So at the industry level, we still see increased employment because for some technologies like robotics, it has been kind of found that at the local firm level, firms that invest in robotics might increase their employment, but at the industry level, the employment would fall. So we don't see that. We actually see increases in employment even at the industry level.
Okay, so I think the concern as expressed popularly would be that in the aggregate, employment would still fall when you aggregate across all industries. The whole technological unemployment, I guess, hypothesis. You can't say anything to that yet.
No, okay. Because we really rely on this cross-sectional differences as well. Right, we can correlate in the time series the rise of AI and employment, but I think that will be a weaker claim that we would be able to make.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I think Mane has his hand up as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. I was wondering whether this is not actually a lower bound, because it's easy of benefits of AI. It's easy to measure product innovation because you have new products, patents, but process innovation is pretty difficult to capture at the firm level internal, unless you have a lot of internal information where they say, oh, we restructure this and that, we merge this department with that department, thanks to this AI robot that all of a sudden does this job faster and easier. I was wondering if what proxies might be there. You know, perhaps they mention it in the quarterly reviews that all of a sudden you find AI and process innovation in the same sentence, stuff like that.
Yeah, so in this paper, we just use kind of existing classifications of patents into product and process patents. And there we find this increase in product patents. We actually have a null result for process patents, consistent with our null result in other productivity measures. Now, of course, patenting, right, that's not necessarily going to reflect all of the process innovation that you do. But that's the only measure we're able to observe. In a follow-up paper, we look at I think like a related but slightly different question, which is how is AI related to changes in the workforce composition? So firms that are investing in AI, what kinds of workers are they hiring more or less of, and how is their kind of structure in terms of their hierarchical structure? How does that change with AI investments? So that work is still pretty preliminary, but so far we find that firms investing in AI tend to become kind of less hierarchical in the sense of having more workers in sort of low, kind of more independent contributor positions rather than loading heavily on the managerial layers.
Understand.
So at the industry level, as I mentioned, we also see growth. We do see increased concentration. So the benefits of AI investments are not evenly distributed across firms. The firms that are already largest and most productive are also the ones that see the highest effects with AI investments. So as a result, at the industry level, more and more AI investment is related to a larger increase in industry concentration. To summarize our main takeaway, it's that AI does help for individual firms. It increases firm growth, and that comes mostly from product innovation as firms are able to better and faster learn what products will suit their customers. We kind of touch on a couple of different literatures. Of course, there is a thriving literature on artificial intelligence and big data. Most of that looks at kind of occupation level. So we really focus on firm level, what are AI investments doing for firms, rather than which occupation groups are at more risk of being displaced by AI. That, of course, relates to the broader literature on technology adoption, what effects that has, which has been different for different types of technologies. So in the case of AI, our results indicate that AI does have an effect, and it's mostly through innovation rather than through just pure cost cutting. We also, in the process, propose a new way of measuring intangible capital when it comes to human capital by leveraging these resumes and identifying people that are skilled in a particular area like AI. So we hope that will be something that will be useful going forward. And our industry results also speak a little bit to the debate about rising concentration and the notion that technology adoption can actually contribute to that, that firms that are already well positioned are the ones that are able to benefit from new technologies the most. All right, so let me tell you about the data and our new measure of AI investments first. So
Anastassia,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. I just have a quick question here, because this is, I think, part of the setup of your question. So if what's happening is through innovation, the counterfactual would be the same companies trying to innovate in the old way, which means hiring more researchers, for example. So the nature of your message seems to be that qualitatively innovation is different because somehow we're now using AI. So I was thinking if the appropriate comparison when talking about employment shouldn't be, well, you know, if we wanted to innovate the old way without AI, we would have hired 100 researchers. Because of AI, we only hired 10.
Yeah, so there are two ways you can do it, right? If you're able to innovate more efficiently, one is Okay, you achieve the same level of innovation, but now hiring one AI guy instead of 10 researchers. The other is just you increase the quantity and the speed. So kind of the types of examples that we have in mind with innovation would be when the kind of I think some of the technical sort of heads of Moderna were reflecting about how AI technologies have helped them basically pursue that entire exploration development process for the COVID vaccine in 63 days. So they were able to explore and test a lot faster when previously that would have taken on the order of years. So that's, I think, where a lot of it comes in is just that they're able to pursue more innovation at a higher speed without necessarily scaling down.
Okay, so we could basically say that we get that innovation at a much lower cost eventually, though, because the alternative would have been 1,000, I don't know, like people for 1 year employed. Now we just have the machine running for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah.
And are there? I see there are some messages in the chat. I don't know if those are questions or not, but I will not get sidetracked by going into. All right, so before I kind of present our measurement of AI, let me just make sure that we're kind of on the same page about what we even mean by AI, as that's kind of a fuzzy word itself. What we mean by AI are basically algorithms that can learn and make predictions from data. And the main kind of commercial interests in AI have been in machine learning, computer vision, and natural language processing. Since around 2012 is when firms really started investing in AI. Now, how do we see this as different from either other automation technologies or old school data analysis, right? Because making predictions from data can also just be done in Excel. So how we kind of see these AI technologies, machine learning, computer science, and computer vision, and natural language processing as different from automation is that automation, like robotics, typically automates low-skilled, manual, repetitive tasks, versus AI automates these higher skill tasks like prediction, anomaly detection, classification. So just different tasks that we're automating. How it differs from old school data analysis methods is just a matter of degree of sophistication. So ability to model more complex nonlinear relationships, and ability to process larger unstructured data sets, including visual data, language data. Right? So computer vision, natural language processing are able to deal with the kind of data format that some previous data analysts with Excel at a firm would not have been able to use at all. And the key inputs into AI are, of course, data itself. Without having data, there's no point trying to build prediction algorithms on data. Computing power, that's arguably the input that has kind of made the commercial use of AI so popular in the last decade, is that the computing power has gotten much less of a constraint, a lot cheaper, a lot more available. So the computing power is not kind of really the limiting factor anymore. Data is, but data is something that is also takes longer to build up. So largely firms either have that tradition of keeping good data and kind of and having data to use or not. The factor that is very important, and that is something that firms would have been able to kind of invest in this decade since AI became popular commercially, is the human capital to actually develop or implement AI algorithms. So in this paper, we're not kind of looking at firms whose main goal is to propose some new AI algorithms, which is why we don't use something like AI patents to measure AI activity. We're not really thinking about AI inventing firms. We're thinking about AI using firms. But that still requires human capital to use the technology. So you might have an AI researcher internally who's actually developing the methods, or you might have an AI researcher or data scientist internally who's able to bring in the methods that are developed elsewhere and tailor them to the problem within the firm. So with that in mind, how do we actually measure this human capital aspect of AI? So we start out with job postings, about 180 million job postings from Bird and Glass Technologies, which offer comprehensive coverage of pretty much all online job openings in 2007, and then from 2010 onwards consistently. This is also about 60 to 70% of all job postings in the US. So most job postings in the US do get posted online and therefore picked up by Burning Glass. And one of the neat features of this data set is that Burning Glass offers a detailed taxonomy of required skills for each job. So each job is associated with kind of what are the skills required in that job, and that's going to help us determine which skills empirically are AI relevant skills. And the second and main data set that we use is a data set of resumes, or alternatively employment profiles, from Cognizant. Cognizant is a UK-based firm. It's an aggregator of public information on individuals and firms. In this kind of version of the data, there were about 535 million full profiles globally, and a profile would include job history, so previous employment of the person, current employment of the person, their education, as well as anything else that they would put on their resume. So they have publications, that would go in their resume. They have patents, that would go in their resume. If they want some awards, that would go in their resume, and so on. So the kind of important feature of this data set, and the reason that we focus on it is the main one, is that, of course, this is what captures actual hiring. So job postings is firms' kind of attempts to hire an AI or stated interest in hiring a certain area, but the resumes reflect whether the firm actually was able to hire, rather than making job postings and not being able to fill them, or potentially being able to fill them to some recruiter without making a job posting, and so on. Encouragingly, though, when we repeat all of the analysis with just the job postings data, we get very, very similar results. So the two measures of AI investment constructed from job postings versus resumes are highly correlated, correlation of 65%, and gives some consistent results. Why is this nice? Because the job postings data, Burning Glass Technologies, is more widely available to researchers. It has been used by other research teams. It's available for purchase, versus the resume data is more proprietary. So by doing this validation, it's encouraging that if somebody doesn't have access to the resume data, they can just use the job postings data. And that seems to be a good enough measure of AI. That said, a couple of
just quick smell test. Just of this sort of data set size, what fraction is are you estimating as like AI relevant people or job postings?
I'll get to that in a couple of slides. It's very small. Yeah, AI people are not common at all in these data. So why is resume data, our resume data, good resume data to do this kind of validation and to use as our primary source of data? It's really high coverage. So as of 2018, we cover about 64% of US employees. So we do cover the majority of US employment. So it's kind of a comprehensive reflection of what's actually going on in US firms. We capture actual hiring, not just demand. And importantly, job resumes will also reflect any AI skilled labor that gets brought in by acquisition. So one concern with job postings might be, well, AI is the kind of thing that you don't go out and hire an AI researcher, you basically buy an AI startup and you get the 4 AI researchers of that AI startup as a team inside your firm. That doesn't seem to be the main way through which firms onboard AI talent. Because when we take a look at the resumes of people, which does reflect this, if somebody was working in an AI startup and then got bought by a larger firm, their resume will reflect that. They would have the larger firm as their new employer. And this doesn't seem to be the main way that firms hire AI workers, but good to be able to validate that. We're also able to measure and control for other technologies like IT, data analysis. So I'll talk about how our effects are specific to AI rather than just the fact that AI may be correlated with some other technology use. And finally, even though from our kind of detailed look at the data and case studies on specific firms, we can see that human capital really is necessary. So even if firms are using external software, they still need to hire internal AI specialist people within the firm to use that software. What's nice about the resume data is that we can actually measure external AI software use as well by searching through job descriptions for any mention of that external software. So things like IBM Watson, Salesforce software, and so on, we can actually search in the job descriptions, and we could augment our human capital-based measure with these external software use measures and confirm that our results remain very similar. Yes, Colin.
Can you track actual AI engineers? Can you look at people's GitHub repos and see what the contents of those are, or is that too granular?
Yeah, so we haven't looked at the people any further. We kind of look at their profiles, right, at their resumes, and see that it does look like they're doing AI, but no, there's no measure of the quality type of their
Yeah, I
code.
guess if you can if you can make your CV look like you're doing AI, even if you're not really, then you could probably make your GitHub repo look the same way, I would guess. Okay, thank you.
All right, so first, how do we actually get the search terms to search for in these resumes? We start out with just kind of the concepts of artificial intelligence, machine learning, natural language processing, computer vision. And then for every skill in the job postings data, we'll look at the percentage of jobs requiring that skill that also require one of these core AI areas. I think this kind of is easiest to explain with just examples. So deep learning, for example, if we look at all job postings that have deep learning in their required skills, 86% of those will also explicitly list either artificial intelligence or machine learning or computer vision or natural language processing. So deep learning is clearly an AI related field because it's very rare that you would have deep learning as a required field and not have explicit mention of these kind of broad AI areas. Information retrieval can be useful in AI, but it's not necessarily an AI related skill. So 37% of job postings that require information retrieval will also explicitly mention the core AI areas. And communication skills is definitely not an AI skill. So out of all of the many job postings that will list communication skills as a required skill, some small fraction, 0.3%, will also explicitly list the AI core areas, but almost like the vast majority of job postings with communication skills will have nothing to do with AI. So this allows us to get an empirical measure of kind of AI relatedness for each individual skill in the data. That way we don't have to set out and define ourselves whether we think like deep learning is an AI skill or Python. Like Python is, I guess, an example like information retrieval. It's often does appear in AI postings, but it also appears in non-AI postings. So the actual fraction of job postings that require Python that also will explicitly mention AI areas is not that high. It's not an AI specific skill, even though it is a skill that is also useful for AI. So this kind of methodology allows us to avoid having to make a discretionary choice of our own about kind of how we view each potential technical skill. Yeah, Mine?
Some firms decide to hire. Some firms who are completely afraid of this new thing decide to create a little spin-off, and they might hold shares in that startup that is doing all the AI related stuff that nobody understands. Some might rely on IBM to sell like a consulting service for some particular AI input. So this is a very, how shall we say, traditional classical way of incorporating the new technology in the firm, but firms are using very different strategies to access stuff that looks dangerous. Maybe you don't want to invest so much in an AI and so on and so forth. So I was wondering if you could capture this, or this could play a role in the identification strategy, for example.
Yeah, so we in terms of kind of I guess enterprises that are kind of subsidiaries that are owned but will have different names, we try to capture all of that. So our co-author at at AI for Good has also been the chief science officer at Cognizant, leading their team, and they've done a lot of work trying to basically figure out what different brand names, subsidiaries, etc., correspond to as firms. Also because sometimes employees list things oddly, right, on their resume. If they're working Banana Republic, they'll just write Banana Republic. They're not going to write Gap Incorporated because they associated their employment with the brand rather than with the firm. So to the extent that that's transparent, that it's a subsidiary that is easy to kind of see, we will have done kind of the best we can on the Cognizant side to map that to the overall firm. As an example, kind of IBM, right? People who are working on even though it's not like a separate thing, but people who are working on Watson, they often, like the researchers would just put like TJ Watson Research Center as their employer because they thought that sounded cooler than IBM, the company. And we kind of spend a lot of time trying to make sure that that does get assigned to IBM. And the second point, kind of the use of external consulting services. So all I can say is that we do try to measure kind of mentions of the external products. And when we look at specific firms, we do kind of deep dive case studies about, this might be 15 firms, and we include like 4 large firms across different industries in the appendix of the paper. What we find is that they tend to be complementary. So at the time when, I think it was GlaxoSmithKline or something, brought in like a big partnership with IBM Watson to use their consulting services, that was also the year that they saw the highest increase in their internal AI employees. So they are correlated in terms of still needing the internal human capital to be able to work with those tools.
Perfect, thank you.
Right, so once we get the AI relevance of all the skills from the job postings, then we use the resumes to actually classify the workers as AI workers or not. So we focus on just the skills that have been identified as kind of the most AI relevant. And we vary that threshold, but the kind of default is about 70%. So deep learning with its 85% relevance would fall into that versus information retrieval would not. And then we search for that handful of super AI relevant skills in the job title of a job, the job description, and any publications, patents, or awards that the person got during that job. And we allow a 1-year lag for receiving publications or awards. So if they got an AI patent 1 year after leaving that job, we still assign it to that job. So as an example, if somebody's job title is senior machine learning developer, we would say that they're an AI worker. If their job description mentions TensorFlow and building deep learning models, we will classify them as an AI worker. And if they have a publication on neural networks, we will also classify them as an AI worker. The reason we look at these kind of secondary fields like publications, patents, is that it's common for somebody's job description to just be software engineer, right? And then whether they're an AI or non-AI software engineer, if they're publishing on neural networks, then they're going to be an AI person. And if they're not, then we don't classify them as such. Yeah, Colin.
For publications, can you pick up on the venue as well? Like, are you picking up on the top AI conferences regardless of what's in the title?
Here we don't. We just look at kind of any publications that you list on the resume. Yeah, when we talk about the instrument there, we kind of classify what journals are AI. It's an entire procedure of like AI, identifying AI journals and then AI publications. When we do the classification of like universities that are strong in AI. Here it's just, are you publishing about AI? Then you're probably doing AI.
Because I mean, I'm wondering as a robustness check, whether just assuming that a NeurIPS publication is going to be an AI ML publication, regardless of what the title is. But I don't, I mean, okay, if you're looking for robustness checks, I mean,
exactly. We have a classification of journals, like which computer science journals are AI versus not from our instruments. So that is something that we could apply to the resume data as well. And then we aggregate up to the firm level. So for each firm, we look at what percentage of all workers at that firm in that year are AI workers, and match that to CompuStat to get our outcome variable. So we do focus on US firms that are publicly traded because those are the firms for which we can actually see sales, employment, so on. So to, I think it was Malesh's earlier question about the share of like how common are these AI workers? And the answer is not that common at all. So on the left axis is the share of AI workers. So this is in the resume data, and it's in blue. And it goes up from like 0.05% to 0.3% by 2018. And on the right axis is the share of AI job postings. That's in red, and that goes up from around 0.1% to 0.8%. So AI job postings are more common than actual AI workers. And that might make sense if it's difficult to hire AI talent, but it's still a very low fraction of overall jobs. In terms of magnitude of this workforce, it's comparable to, say, inventors. So patenting inventors in US firms are roughly of that same order of magnitude as AI specialists. We do see a big increase though. So from like 0.05% to 0.3%, that's a six-fold increase. Not much at all going on from 2007 to 2010, and then from like 2011-ish onwards, we start seeing an increase in AI labor at firms, consistent with commercial use of AI getting popular around that time. This increase is visible pretty much in all industry sectors. So here we do it by industry, and we just break down the time period into two: early time period until 2014, and then from 2015 to 2018. And of course, like in the information sector, we'll have the highest share of AI workers, but the proportional increase is actually quite large in all sectors, including, say, retail trade, which had almost no AI workers in the first half of the sample and does have some AI workers in the second. All right, so let's see what actually happens at these firms. I'm going to start with a specification that just looks over the entire time period, and then we're going to dig into a lot of additional things depending on time. So our first and main specification is just a long differences regression that goes from 2010 to 2018. It looks at what is the change in the share of AI workers at the firm level over that time period, and then regresses the change in the outcome variable on that. So we look at how this increase in the share of AI workers over those 8 years correlated with the increase in sales, increase in employment, and increase in market valuation. And we include controls for the beginning values of sales, employment, market valuation, markups, R&D, and so on at the firms as of 2010, and then look at how things change from 2010 onward. So these standard kind of OLS results show about 20% increase in sales over the 8 years. So that would correspond to about 2.5% sales growth per year, per kind of one standard deviation increase in the share of AI workers. Similar magnitude increase in employment, and slightly bigger, but again, similar, not statistically different, increase in market valuation. So these first results suggest that firms that are investing in AI are growing more, and actually not just growing more in terms of their output, their sales, but also growing more in terms of their employment, contrary to displacing workers. Now let's talk about all of the possible pushback that might come to mind when looking at these long difference correlations. The first one we've already talked about, right, that maybe we're not measuring the entirety of AI investments with the human capital angle. Firms might purchase external AI, so we've talked about it a couple of times. Let's skip that one. Second is that we might have reverse causality or omitted variables. And so we're kind of attributing, right, this growth to AI when it's not really driven by AI. So we do a couple of things. The simpler one is just breaking down the period into two halves and look at AI investments in the first, right, and do like a predictive regression to then look at sales in the latter. The other, which I think is more interesting because it's also informative about when exactly the effect of AI starts to kick in, is we look at dynamic effects of firm growth around AI investments. So basically here we regress, say, sales in each year on the share of AI workers in both previous years as well as future years. So that allows for kind of the effect to go in either direction. So year zero is around kind of here. We look at 2 years for a pre-trend, and then up to 5 years afterwards. And actually, interestingly, there is no effect even kind of in sales 1 year after AI investments. So it's only really about 2, 3, 4 years that we're starting to see a relationship between sales 2 or 3 years later and AI hiring 2 or 3 years earlier. The other kind of potential concern that we might have is, okay, so it does look like the effect on sales and employment follows the AI investments, but is it AI investments or is it something else that AI investments are just a proxy for? Specifically, AI might be correlated with other technologies, and prior research has shown that other technologies have effects on firm growth, so we're just picking that up. So what we can do here is we can use our data to also measure the share of employees who are in IT or in data analytics or in robotics, and include that as an additional control and see whether that moves our estimates of the AI effect, as well as also for curiosity what those other technologies with their coefficients look like. So we do this here. So the top row is the share of AI workers. And encouragingly, those coefficients don't move much at all as we incorporate controls for other technologies. We add the share of robotics workers. That one actually doesn't load positively in our setting. The share of non-AI data workers, that's basically workers who can work on data maintenance, data management, some database type workers, and then non-AI data analysis workers. Those would be the kind of the old school data analysts who are running their kind of averages or regressions with Excel instead of doing AI with Python. And we also look at IT workers, such as general IT. These are also data workers, data analysis workers, IT workers do all kind of positively correlate with growth. Not that big of an effect for the non-AI traditional data analysis, bigger effects for IT and data workers, but importantly, they do not appear to at all eat away at the estimated coefficient on A. All right, then this one I think I'll kind of just describe, but it's a little bit sort of less, I think, critical. There may be some selection concerns about if we're looking at the long difference regression from 2010 to 2018, we're kind of restricting the sample to firms that exist in both 2010 and 2018, and these may be a special subsample of firms. So what's nice is that when we do the dynamic effects that I showed you earlier with kind of this, how does sales around AI investments 5 years after AI, up to 5 years after AI investments and up to 2 years prior, how does that look? In that analysis, we don't have any restrictions on firms having to exist for the entire time period, and we still get coefficients that add up to something comparable. The effect there is like 2% per year, so comparable to the 2.5-ish that we're getting from long difference regressions. And when we do our industry level tests, we also do those on both samples, the sample of firms that exist in both 2010 and 2018, as well as the sample of all firms, because of the industry level, you can do industry average with different compositions. And the results are very similar there as well. And so for any remaining heterogeneity concerns that we might still have. We're also very excited about this new instrument that we brought in, mostly because we think it's just an interesting data set in and of itself, this kind of network between firms and universities. And we hope it's going to be interestingly useful for other things as well. So let me tell you a bit about that. How are we doing on time? Actually, I can't see the time because it's full screen. How much time do we have?
You have 15 minutes.
15, yeah.
Okay. So I kind of introduced the instrument at the beginning. The idea is basically to measure differences in firms' kind of ex ante exposure to AI labor supply, so that when the AI kind of shock, this interest in commercial use of AI kicks in around 2010 to 2012, and presumably lots of firms would like to hire AI workers, and we do see more job postings than actually AI workers. Some firms will have an easier time actually hiring that talent than other firms, and that will depend on kind of their pre-existing connections. Universities are a big contributor of technical skilled labor, so having connections to universities that have been doing AI research for decades, once a firm does decide to start hiring AI talent, will be helpful for being able to actually find that talent. Just to be kind of upfront, a couple of potential concerns with that instrument and how we deal with them. It might be that universities that are strong in AI are also strong in other things. So then kind of having connections to like AI strong universities, like, well, okay, you're connected to some top university like MIT. And so of course you're gonna be able to hire top people in AI or not, and you're gonna grow more. So we try to screen that out. First of all, in terms of just top like ranking of universities and universities that are strong in AI, those are not that related to each other. So the kind of universities that are strong in AI are not necessarily the top kind of universities based on, say, US News and World Report, but we also actually construct a measure for, say, like computer science strength of universities, and we include that as a control in our instrument to make sure that we're focusing on specifically kind of links to AI strong universities and not just links to good computer science schools. Yeah, Colin?
How are you measuring, have I missed how you're measuring the firm's exposure to the hiring networks?
I'll get to that in a second.
Okay. Because I mean, presumably you could also, I mean, one of the things that happens when an area is really hot is that faculty members start disappearing as well, not just the students. Yeah.
So we focus on kind of hiring students, just because that's going to be bigger. Right? Faculty members are going to be like, there are going to be a couple of firms that might be able to get those, but that's going to reduce our sample significantly. But yes, that I think has been shown to be the case for technical hot areas. And the other thing is we also double check that the networks that firms build in terms of their, like with universities, there's no pre-trend in the firms that are connected to some like Carnegie Mellon, say like AI strong school. It's not the case that those firms were already hiring AI workers in 2009. There's just no AI hiring, so it doesn't look like they were preemptively building those networks. All right, now let me actually tell you how we measure these things. So we need kind of two things. We need to measure which universities are good in AI and which firms have connections to universities that are good in AI. To measure which universities are strong in AI, we use the Microsoft Academic Graph, Google Scholar, but more easy to work with. And we identify all AI publications by basically listing the list of AI journals. Our co-author who's in AI is responsible for that, and then looking at whether each person, each kind of scholar in the Microsoft Academic Graph had publications that were in AI journals. If they did, then they got classified as AI researchers. And then at the university level, we see what percentage of researchers are AI researchers versus non-AI researchers. And then an intermediate category to control for it, what percentage are computer science researchers? So researchers who are publishing in computer science journals, but not the journals that we identified as specifically AI journals. And then for the firm university hiring networks, we use our resume data, because our resume data, we're able to see where people are working as well as where they went to school. So if we look at the employee composition as of 2010, and we focus on all employees who had STEM degrees, so science, technology, engineering, and math, because we've done it both ways. We've looked at all employees and STEM employees. The results are quite similar. The reason that our kind of preferred specification was to use STEM employees is that we realized that firms' hiring networks might actually have separate hiring networks for different types of fields. So they may have specific business schools, right, from which a firm is likely to recruit kind of managerial talent, and then another school from which they might be recruiting their more technical talent. So we look at all of the employees of the firm as of 2010. We look at where they got their degrees, and that gives us a firm university kind of map of connections. So what fraction of your of that firm's STEM workers came from MIT versus what fraction came from Carnegie Mellon versus what fraction came from Princeton. So we do capture 51% of all university graduates in our data. So that's good news. That means we have people fill in their education on their resumes well enough that we're able to kind of, when we compare to the official college graduate statistics in the US, we capture just over half. And in terms of kind of across universities, we're highly correlated. So if MIT has more graduates than Princeton, then we'll have more graduates of MIT in our data than from Princeton. So that's encouraging. All right, so then what is our actual instrument? It's going to be for each firm. We're going to sum over all universities. We're going to look at what share of the pre-existing employee base of that firm in 2010 had come from that university. And then we're going to multiply it by an indicator of whether that university got classified as an AI strong university based on the research output of that university.
It's a binary measure? That's a binary measure, the AI strong?
The AI strong is a binary. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so basically we classify a university if it either has a high enough number, I don't remember the exact numbers anymore, but they're in the paper, either a high enough number of AI researchers or a high enough share of AI researchers. So we capture both smaller schools like Harvey Mudd as well as larger schools.
What's the intuition for not using a continuous measure?
So I guess because we use both of these criteria, right? Combining them into a continuous would also require kind of a similar type of discretion. So we don't want to just use, for example, share of AI researchers, because that would underweight big schools that are strong in AI, but also strong in other things. And we don't want to only use number of AI researchers because that would punish smaller schools that just don't have as many.
Have you played with the threshold, the classification threshold, the 0-1? Okay, okay. So the one that you've got.
What percentage of AI researchers would be needed to get into that threshold? Yes.
Okay.
And here are the results with kind of different controls. So we control for industry and for computer science and top university graduates throughout. And then we either include or don't include the baseline control, so all of the firm characteristics as of 2010, as well as the pre-trend, so the growth in sales prior to 2010 in these specifications, as well as the state fixed effect. So this is something that becomes a little bit more discretionary because, of course, geographic location of firms is another source of ability to hire AI talent, right? If you were located in an area where a lot of universities produce AI kind of students, or a lot of other firms have brought in AI talent, you'll have an easier time hiring. And so we include a state fixed effect, but to be honest, I'm not sure that that's the specification that I would prefer. So we kind of see the results here. The effect sizes are larger. I think for most specifications, they're not significantly different from our OLS results, but they're in terms of the actual coefficient numbers, they're larger than our OLS results. Could be that we're kind of capturing some sort of opportunity costs, right? That firms that are investing in AI are the firms that otherwise maybe don't have as many investment opportunities. So that's why this kind of OLS would sort of understate the effect, but likely it's also just estimation error. All right, so I think I have like maybe 5 minutes left. Is that roughly correct? Okay, so let me just show you the results that I mentioned at the very beginning, which is kind of the mechanisms. Are we seeing this growth because firms are cutting their costs and becoming more productive, or are we seeing this growth because firms are kind of able to produce more new things? So I'll skip the motivation and just show you the results given the time constraint. So this here is product innovation. We look at changes in trademarking activity, changes in specifically product patents. So we use prior researchers' methodology to split out product versus process patents. And we look at a product fluidity measure, which basically looks at the extent to which the way that firms describe their products in their company filings changes over time. The idea is that if they produce more new products, they will also have more changes in the text of their 10K talking about those products. And we have consistent increases in all of these measures. Firms that invest in AI more, trademark more, produce more product patents, produce and change their product portfolio descriptions more. We also, in the paper, instrument these results and get consistent results. I did not include that in the slides, as I knew that by the time I'll get here, our time will be pretty short. And here are productivity measures. So we look at whether firms that invest more in AI are able to kind of increase their sales per worker, increase their revenue TFP, or increase their process patents. And we have consistently 0 results across these. So not surprising, given that we saw an increase in employment that was pretty much same as increase in sales. So even though these firms are growing, they're scaling up. Everything's scaling up their employment, they're scaling up their costs. If we take a look at kind of operating expenditures of these firms, those are growing same pace as their sales as well. So that's still good. If we're able to produce twice more, at the same sales per worker, that's a benefit. But we're not seeing those firms kind of reduce their workforce or reduce their costs, at least yet, right? So there's the caveat that we're only looking at the first decade of AI use. Capturing market share is primary, and once that's been accomplished, maybe at that point firms will start cutting their costs. But for now, we don't see any evidence of increased productivity or cost cutting. All right, and then our last results are the industry level. As I mentioned, we do see growth in both sales and employment. So to, I think, Colin's earlier question, we don't look at the economy-wide effects, but at least at industry level, it looks like we're not kind of seeing the AI investing firms grow in employment while everybody else is shrinking. We do see growth at industry level, but the gains are not evenly distributed. If we take a look at the estimated effects of AI by firm tercile, the smallest tercile of firms, there is no effect. If we only estimate our coefficients on that sample, basically 0 effect. It's only the larger firms that actually have an association between AI investments and growth. And so as a result, at the firm level, concentration goes up with AI investments. All right, so let me wrap up, hopefully almost on time. So in this paper, we propose a measure of firm level AI investments, and we use it to study what happens when firms invest in AI. And our evidence suggests that AI investments help firms grow, and that growth comes mostly through product innovation without much kind of cost cutting or productivity gains. Thank you, and I'll be happy to stick around for more questions.
Right. Thank you. In the past, just any attendees who want to join, if you just raise your hand, we can promote you to a panelist. and you can turn on your video if you have questions. Have we stopped recording?